I am so honored to have Dr. Lora Beth Escalante here, another fellow superstar from Silence Education. So, welcome, Dr. Laura, to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
We're so honored to have you, and we're going to be highlighting your new book, Motivating ELLs 25 Activities to Inspire and Engage Students. So, we're so excited for that. Before we get there, can you tell us what is one of your proudest professional achievements?
I guess the first one that comes to mind is completing my doctoral degree.
Yes.
And that's because it was a really long road. And a very wise woman named Dr. Lada, who's also inside this education, she told me at the very beginning, enjoy the journey. Don't just do it for the destination, enjoy the journey. And that has really served me so well because I kind of carved my own path and I took a few alternate routes that other people might not take. And it worked for me. So I often share that with teachers as well and students. You don't have to accomplish something the way other people have accomplished it. You can make your own way. You can decide how it's going to work for you. So um, I always tell people the most amazing, graceful God gift I was given was I went and turned in my dissertation, and the next day I had a baby. So, and praise the Lord, he was a week late because otherwise I wouldn't have gotten it turned in. That.
Right.
So that was just one of those kind of God winks, like, wow, I did it. I made it happen. It was a long journey, but I got through it. So,
You said that you, Dr. Laura, amazing professional consultant, leader, author. She said that enjoy the journey. What was, there are a lot of doctoral students who are listening to the podcast. What part of the journey did you like the most?
ooh, okay. Man, these are great questions. Thank you. It's really fun to think about that. I think the most enjoyable part to me was because I recorded my participants and they were fourth grade students. I recorded them creating one act plays using both Spanish and English. So when I listened to them, I laughed so hard that I often would have to go back and listen again because I was trying to take notes and create categories, dissect the data, right? But I laughed so hard that my face would hurt and I would have to start over because I couldn't even make out what they were saying. So that was definitely the funnest part. And it took hours and hours and hours of listening, but I honestly enjoyed most of it because it was so humorous. And because I was getting an inside glimpse of what I normally would only see the outside,
Right.
right? Because I often had my students working in cooperative groups, but to actually hear the details of their conversations and how they were negotiating language, it was so fascinating that I really thought at that moment, okay, all that coursework and all that prep was worth it because this is so insightful. This is so fun. So that was probably the most enjoyable part. Yeah. So just enjoy what you choose for your own research to pick something that you are really going to enjoy
Right.
working with.
You said that you worked with fourth graders, so we have lots of elementary school teachers that listen as well. Can you tell us about your dissertation? What was the topic, and what did you
Sure.
learn from it?
It's like, oh, it's going to be so hard to tell you all about it. You have to stop me, right? Basically, I just really wanted to see how translanguaging worked in action with my students because I had dual language students at the time. So I had native English speakers and native Spanish speakers and some simultaneous bilinguals. And so it was just a beautiful blend of students. And it was towards the end of the year. So they were already used to working in groups. So and they were already used to creating one act plays in social studies. And I know you teach social studies. So that was really neat connection I was just thinking of. Basically, I was teaching Texas history at the time. And so I asked them to create these one act plays that would incorporate the vocabulary they had learned, the characters they had learned about, the historical figures. And so when they were working on it together, I told them your final product has to be in Spanish because that was the target language. But you can use Spanish and English to negotiate and figure out how you want that to sound. And then, of course, there were parameters in which, each character had to speak a certain amount of times. They had to incorporate the vocabulary. It had to be within this length of, time. And so they had a lot of fun with it. and they became basically screenwriters, because that's what they were taking the text and creating a live, just oral language basically. So I wanted to see how their oral language was developing as they were negotiating meaning in a, real life situation, in that they had to really have a give and take with other speakers
It,
to make decisions.
it's rigorous, it's authentic, it's something that they might do in the future that they'll have to possibly, well, they'll definitely have to work with other people
Right.
to create something,
That's
right?
true.
So you're giving them that authentic collaborative experience. How beautiful. And in that fourth grade,
It was really fun.
yeah,
Yes.
right. What did you learn about translanguaging as you listened to students?
I mean, there were some really just kind of epiphanies that I had, where I saw the different dynamics of how basically everyone's personality, of course, plays a role in the way they negotiate language with others, right? So there would be different configurations of students, and so I get to see, wow, in this group the student was more dominant, but in this group they held back a little bit and did more listening and just absorbed more of the information. So it was really fun to see how their personalities interacted, right? And then with language, to see that even though the majority of their conversations were in English, because most of them were actually more English dominant, even though technically half of my students spoke Spanish as a native language at home.
Right.
But most of the conversations were in English, yet the final products were in Spanish. And there was a very fluid transition between both. There were very few pauses in which, they had to struggle, and the times that they did struggle, you saw how they were picking each other's brains, like, how would you say that in Spanish? Well, how would we express that? Or what kind of emotion do we want to, convey in this scene? And just seeing that there is such a connection between languages, no matter what your native language is, you're going to transfer all those skills and all that background knowledge into learning whatever your next target language is. So that was really fun to see.
This really speaks at the topic of multilingual classrooms. I am, if I could have a wand and make one thing possible for just schools, it would be no more English only zones, no more English only signs. And you talked about that and how students are using their entire tools of linguistic resources to communicate and to be understood. And that's what I hope teachers will hear consistently throughout this podcast, that, oh, yes, we are recognizing that students have assets and it comes in their culture, in the form of their culture and also their language. And so let's use it so they can participate. I always tell teachers, we want students to participate, seek participation before perfection. Right? And this talks
Yes.
about like the grammar part, because some teachers are like, they have to get the grammar right. Well, let's get them to participate, seek participation before perfection.
That sounds like a title to a book, Tan. Seek participation before perfection. I
Yes.
love it. I love it. Yes, it's so true. I was just thinking, one of my favorite authors and speakers and professors is Kathy Escamilla. And one of the big ideas that I took away from her is, we are not two separate brains. Bilingual people don't have two separate brains. We're always a bilingual person. We're always working with different languages in our brain. So, like you said, why not encourage students to tap into their linguistic resources?
She's coming on my
So, yeah.
podcast as well. So I'm excited.
Oh, she's on your podcast?
Yeah, and Ophelia Cosilla was also on my podcast.
Oh,
Yeah.
Ophelia. I got to meet her in person someday. I
Yeah.
quoted her in my dissertation probably more than anybody.
She is one of the leaders in our field.
She was so inspirational to me. Yes.
Well, speaking of inspiration, I know that your book is inspiring many, many teachers out there. So every book starts with a seed. What was the seed of your book?
Oh, man. I think the seed started when I was working in a very challenging school, middle school, in a hard to serve district. And I was coaching, I was doing some instructional coaching with some teachers, and I had a brand new teacher.
Mm.
And of course, she was um, going through a lot of emotional ups and downs because it was a challenging school and it was her first year, just like pile all that on top of each other, right? And I broke it down for her and I said, let's try one activity that we think could keep students 100% engaged and help develop their language. Like, let's just start with one strong activity. So we did um, basically stations around the room, and they were very structured, high structure, because those students really needed high structure. And I just remember looking at her and looking at the students and just being amazed how they were engaged. And we kept looking at each other like, oh my goodness, like they're enjoying learning, they're writing complete sentences, they're using vocabulary. And so I remember thinking, okay, if these students can be this engaged
Right.
when they're usually not engaged in other classes, that means this activity works. That means that this structure works, right? And of course, it can be tweaked for different populations and target languages, et cetera, et cetera. But when I saw that that worked, I thought, okay, what are the activities that will help develop language and keep students engaged and motivated? Those are the ones, if I could put those all together in a book, right? And then it could be so useful for teachers. That was the seed. I thought, okay, now I have the idea that I want to share with teachers. And that's when John and I started John Seidlitz and I started collaborating and thinking, okay, how could we put this into a really usable format for
Right.
teachers?
Right. I know that teachers, when I kind of consult, they'll always say, "Give me the strategies. Give me the strategies. I don't want to hear the theories." Right. So I love this book instantly because there are 20 strategies that you're going to provide with us already, right? And it's all connected to research, right?
Right.
Because you're a PhD, you have a PhD. Of course, everything's going to be connected to research and evidence-based information and research. So you have in the beginning of your book, you have a section called "Getting Started with Motivating English Language Learners." Let's start with that. What is a challenge for? You said a challenge for educators of ELs. Can you talk about that?
Right. I think what the biggest challenge, just thinking of, like the summer is almost here and they're thinking already teachers can't help themselves. They're thinking about the new school year.
Yes.
And I think that, getting to know your students, and even though it's like the last section in the book, but cultivating relationships has to come first. It has to come first. Even when you're meeting someone for the first time, like you and I met this morning, right? And we just dove in like, hey, tell me your situation. What are you teaching? What are you doing? What's your life like? Um, it's so easy. And I'm speaking for myself. It's so easy to overlook that because you're excited about your curriculum, your content. Like, I can't wait to teach them about, world history or whatever it is. Right. But yet you have to take a few steps back and realize it's not going to take you that long if you are really make a concerted effort to get to know your students as individuals. And I try to describe in the book that it's not doesn't have to be complicated either. You don't have to know your students' whole history. You might just know what their favorite, breakfast food is or their favorite drink to have in the morning, right? It could be something really simple, but it can create that quick instant connection that's going to last and that's going to grow with your time, with that student. And then they're going to want to learn from you. They're going to be willing to have that give and take where they're exchanging ideas and they're open to what you have to teach.
Because all it takes are for some kids to that quick conversation at the door, or that quick
Yeah.
conversation when we're conferencing with kids, like before we get into like that text when we say like, "Oh hey, how was that play that you went through?" Or like, "Oh hey,
Right.
how was that sports game that you just went through?" And then we go and
Yeah.
talk about okay, let's look at your argument text, right? Or like,
Yes.
right? And so like,
Acknowledge that they have interest. They have individual interests. Yeah.
and now
And it's
that we're online, we have that opportunity to like, hey, tell us, pick one thing that you're grateful for and that happened in the last 24 hours, right? And that's
yes.
so easy, and kids can like, say so many different things that I never knew about kids, but now have the opportunity because I'm asking kids online this way,
Yeah.
right?
And it just when you evoke laughter or just an emotion,
Right.
you have a much greater chance. I remember being in it might have been that same middle school that I was thinking where the seed was planted, and the teacher pulled out from her closet bags of little Takis. I don't know if you know what those are.
Yeah,
The
candy.
little kind of spicy
Yeah.
rolled up chips, like corn
Yes.
chips. Oh, the kids went nuts. These were middle schoolers. They went nuts. And all she was doing was like, hey, I'm going to show my appreciation for your complete sentences and for you working well in your teams. And the team that's written the most complete sentences at the end of this round gets a bag of Takis because she knew that was their favorite snack. And how did she know that? Well, she had had a quick conversation, right? Or she had asked them, hey, what was your favorite thing you ate today? And kids had said Takis, the week before. So she just took it upon herself. Okay, I'm going to get a bag of Takis. So that was just really, like you said, it's really simple, but effective because they know, wow, she was paying attention.
Right.
We were talking about our favorite snack and she might not even like it, but she was paying attention to what we like.
Right. It's a conscious effort to get to know kids, but
Yeah.
it doesn't mean like the 40 minutes of getting to know kids. It might be just a
Right. It can be
question.
very quick. Yeah.
Right. The second part you have is two keys to motivation for ELs. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Okay. So basically, you have to make some sort of connection to what they already know, right? So you have to think about, you know, what if their experiences led them to up to the point I'm working with them, right? And then how can I make them feel comfortable? So talking about that effective filter, right? How can I make them feel comfortable working with me, working with each other, whether it's in a virtual setting or if it's in person, so that they're willing to take that extra step into language learning. And when you're willing, that's when the magic happens, right? That's when the language learning. It's like I'm going to quote you again, Ty. I'm going to quote you. Seek participation before perfection. So if you can get them to participate because they feel comfortable and you've helped lower that effective filter, then they're not going to worry as much about the perfection, right? They're going to worry more about, they're going to be engaged with the communication piece of it, right? Just being active and being a part of the lesson, as opposed to, oh my goodness, am I saying it right? I don't remember that word. I'm going to pronounce it wrong. I'm going to make a fool of myself, or those kind of things that we all experience as language learners. We've all been through that if you learned a second language.
Right. It's because as teachers, or in particular language specialists, kids are on edge with us in the beginning because they're like, oh no, my grammar is not good. It's not. I'm not doing it well, and they have all these insecurities. But when we take the time to say, oh, it's like we want you just to participate. It's okay. We'll get there. We're not trying to fix you. It's okay. This is just trial, and this is just getting familiar and developing your competency. It's okay. And
Right.
when kids realize, oh, okay, I'm in a safe, supportive, welcoming place, they're going to be like, oh, yeah, it's going to be
Yeah.
okay to take risk.
Right. And you show them that you're a risk taker too. If you're, like you mentioned, that you have students from all over Southeast Asia and other places in the world, they have different native languages. If you're willing to take the risk and learn a couple words in their native language and show them, hey, I might not be pronouncing it perfectly, but I'm making the effort to show you that I value your native language, that goes a long way. And I mean, Thailand was the perfect example for me. In fact, I use it often in my trainings because in Thailand, I know that I had horrendous pronunciation. However, However, the people were so willing to let me try, right?
Yes.
And just the ka, right? They were just always like, okay, okay, try again, say it again. And my sweet host mom would say, she'd be like, try again, try again.
Oh.
And then she would laugh about we would have a good laugh, right? It was very friendly, it was very encouraging. Um, and she would joke about how I always wanted to just learn all the food words because I loved all the food in Thailand. And the teachers would say, they would teach us key phrases too, and then have us practice.
Yes.
So just being willing to try and to have an audience in which, where we are the teachers, we accept students' effort and we don't look for that perfection, but we accept the effort. And then they're willing to give just a little bit more, right? They're willing to just extend that learning just a little bit more each time.
Because to put yourself out there to look like you're not competent takes a lot.
Right.
Like, that's really hard for kids. And definitely when let's say that you're a middle schooler, you have all these insecurities of like, oh, I'm not fitting in, I'm not cool enough. And then now you have to speak in a language that you're not familiar with. Oh my goodness. The fact that kids show up, the fact that multilinguals show up to our schools every single day, that is already a victory.
Right.
Right?
Right. And then just pouring into them that just affirming that it's worth the effort, right? Like it's worth it to be a bilingual
Right.
student or a multilingual student, right? It's not easy. Nobody's saying it's easy, but it's worth it. It's going to be worth it.
It's worth it. I also love how you structured your book. It's like the ABCs. I'm like, oh, amplifying language development. The B is bridging content connections, and the C is like cultivating relationships. So that's the last part. We kind of talked about that. Let's spend some time talking about the A.
Okay, great. Yeah, so amplifying language development, I encourage teachers to use just basically using your time wisely, or smarter not harder. How can I create an environment in which students want to practice both reading and writing and listening and speaking, just all those domains of language? They want to practice and revisit those different domains throughout your lesson because they're engaged, right? So things as simple as making it game like, incorporating music, having STEM sentences and key vocabulary with visuals, all those ESL strategies we know about. How can we use those to encourage students to play with language, to have fun with it, and come away maybe chanting something in their head, like they can't get it out of their head because they've been singing a song, or they've learned a poem, or they've talked with other people and they've practiced the same sentence 10 times, so now it's embedded in their brain.
Right.
So just taking those opportunities and using those strategies, those activities in the book, to give them those opportunities that they most likely will not have outside of my classroom,
Right.
or they won't have in that structured way where they feel really confident to practice.
Right. And when you're talking about amplifying language, I hear just getting them to participate in the language.
Yes.
And then that's how
Yeah.
they'll understand the content. And then that's how the language develop. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Can you share with us some strategies? I see you have sections of called move and talk, role play, and music.
Yes. There's kind of an embedded idea in there that I don't explicitly talk about much, but the idea of movement,
Yes.
because I often tell people, our bodies were made for movement. So we're not made to be stationary, sedentary people. That's why, we have muscles and bones. Otherwise, if we were just blobs, then we would not mean to move, right? But our bodies are meant for movement. So, when I'm in person, I often have students use gestures, but you can also do it online. So just using TPR and using different movement and activating your body so that your brain can get enough oxygen. And then remember, because if you have we know that if you have a non-linguistic representation, like a movement or a visual, and then you tie that to the linguistic application, then you're going to be much more successful remembering the term, the idea, the phrase, whatever it might be, right? So in the amplifying language development, I do incorporate that in the move and talk. So at the end of each section, you'll see or I guess I should say throughout the sections, you'll see, and I started with my absolute favorite, which is what I was pretty much describing as my seed earlier, which is the gallery walk and talk. Because you can use visuals, you can use realia, you can use samples, you can use quotes, you can use text, whatever you want to use, but it's structured in a way that there's no burnout. So it's just a quick exposure, maybe a conversation, maybe you're in a breakout room, maybe you're in person in a cooperative group or partnership, and you are practicing that language in a digestible way. So it's maybe just one sentence stem, and then you have you have a visual, or you have a little chunk of text, and then you're going to discuss it with the partner and you're going to write one sentence. So it's digestible, but you're also, again, you're hitting on those domains of language so that it's not just listening, it's not just speaking, it's all four, so that you have a much greater chance of remembering it and engaging with the material.
It's integrated.
Integrated, yeah.
Right.
And the movement is so incredibly helpful. I'm thinking of your middle schoolers, right? Oh man, I mean, for all students really, but I noticed that when students go from elementary to middle school, oftentimes it's really easy for teachers to forget that they need movement too,
Yes.
because in traditional, at least in most American schools, students are moving every like 50 minutes to another class.
Right.
So teachers often can think, well, they're getting some movement, they're walking the hall, or they're transitioning.
Right.
But sitting down for 45 minutes is really tough
Right.
on your brain and your body.
Right.
So having a few moments of transition in your classroom, and of course you have to figure out what works for your students.
Right.
Even just a few transitions can be really, really helpful in keeping you engaged.
The way that I do it for movement is when I teach a very specific tier 2 word, like I'm teaching my kids the word significance. And so what I'll do is I'll teach them the word, but then I'll project American Sign Language Dictionary online. We'll find the word significance. We'll play it, and then the kids will go like this. So that's the symbol. It's like two pinched fingers from the bottom all the way to the top. Yeah, and so that means significance. Yeah, that's it. You got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
What an excellent tool. What an
So-
excellent tool. So tell me one more time, you'll project the American Sign Language website?
Yep. And then when you when you type a word like significance or effect, the word will come up as a picture of someone gesturing the movement in your
The
hands.
movement.
Yeah, and then so I ask
Exactly.
kids to do it, right? And the
Why
kids
not?
remember.
Yeah.
Right?
And I always say it's okay to make up gestures on the fly, but if you
Yeah,
actually know the American Sign Language for it, why not use it, right?
right. Right. So we're teaching kids to be multilingual, and it doesn't have to be linguistic. It can be a different kind
Right.
of lingual.
Exactly. Exactly.
You said you started off with your favorite activity, and so that means yes, that's definitely I want you to talk about. Can you share with us that gallery walk?
Yes. Okay. So the gallery walk and talk is basically where, again, this will work virtually or in person. You create some meaningful stations, and you have, of course, your objectives. So, what is my key vocabulary? What are the key phrases? How I'm going to help my students amplify their language by either writing or speaking, or maybe both in complete sentences around the word. So you create stations around your room. You decide how many is an appropriate number, and then you group students and you give them a specific amount of time to work at each station. I say no more than 5 minutes,
Right.
so that they can work together, maybe have roles that they play. I'm the reader, I'm the writer, you know. And then I often have students chunk up their papers. So they have, okay, station one, station two, they know exactly where to write. So that lowers their affective filter, right? They know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. The instructions are very clear. And then they travel with their partner or their group to the different stations, completing the work. And usually at the end, just to kind of differentiate for those who need it, have a little time to reread your writing, share with another partner, revisit a station if you need to. You have an extra, let's say you have an extra 5 minutes. If you need to go revisit another station, please go do that. If you need assistance, let's say virtually, okay, send me a note in the chat, or let's get in breakout groups and practice all the sentences that we've just written, that kind of thing. So it keeps them very structured, but also builds their confidence because they know that there is a finite task they have at each station.
And are the stations? Do they have to go in a sequence, or they can go to different sequences?
They don't have to. Yeah, I like that idea of gallery. So if you're in a museum and you're looking at artwork in a gallery, you might jump around. So again, you have to read your audience, and that goes back to knowing that your students, right? Those relationships. If you think it would be more beneficial for them to have choice where they go, that can work. If you feel like your students really need that structure of going around like clockwise, let's say, then you might want to keep it to that. And then maybe eventually, once they have that in place, move it to more of a gallery, a choice.
Oh, that's nice. Can you give us an example of two or three stations that you might do?
Sure. Okay. Let's see. Let's talk social studies, right?
Yay.
Yay. You got me ignited about social studies.
I
um, so let's say you have some um, key historical figures,
Yeah.
right? And let's say you're teaching about, the Revolutionary War.
Yes.
So in the United States, so you might have a picture of King George, right? And then you might have the revolutionary soldiers in one picture. So you might have different pictures and they're labeled, or maybe there's a little bit of text at each station, but you might choose the same sentence stem. So for example, you might say blank, as in the person, right, was significant in the revolution during the Revolutionary War because, right? Or the name of this, if you had more beginners, you might just have the name of this revolutionary figure was blank. And
Yes.
so they have all the language necessary to be successful. They don't have to come up with anything if they're beginners, right? They just see the label, they see the sentence, they've practiced the sentence stem, and so they can fill in maybe one or two. Or this illustration depicts blank, and then they just fill in the name. So it could work for beginners, it could work for really any language level, but they're writing complete sentences and they're using that tier two vocabulary, right? They're becoming more confident using that academic vocabulary
And
and
it's
phrasing.
content based because I'm just
Yes.
hearing like they're learning about the content, like the different figures in the Revolutionary War, but they're also looking at tier two words. They're also reading instructions, but they're also writing answers. They're
Yes.
looking at diagrams, and there's so many things that you could create. It's not just it's not activity based. It's actually content based with something with in a way that kids are going to be engaged.
Right. Yes. Keeps them engaged. And it's easy. You can pair up beginners with more advanced students. You don't
Right.
have to worry so much about who do I pair up with.
Right.
It's more, I know these students work well together and they're going to help each other stay engaged and motivated. And I have a sentence for the beginner, but I also have a more challenging sentence for a more advanced learner to challenge them.
And you could have multi-language stations as well. And so there can
Yes.
be like a Spanish, like if you're teaching in a dual language school, you could have a station for in Spanish or the home language, right? Or even if you don't, because I have at least 7, 8, 9 languages in my classes at a time. And
Wow.
so what the instructions might be, find a video about this person in your home language and
Mm.
watch about that person if there is a video, you know? Or
Right.
watch this video but turn on the closed caption but turn it into your home language if you can read it in your home.
Wow. Ooh, I love that twist. I love it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's
Yes,
move.
there are some actually in that there's another activity in here about music that is
Yeah.
similar to what you're describing. Like find a video that describes or that sings about a certain content, right? And there's so many great resources out there that students are actually more adept at finding than we are as educators sometimes. So just putting that responsibility in their hands and that tool in their hands, and they can be the master of it.
There's lots of um, YouTube channels or YouTubers who spend their time making raps about like plant cells and animal cells. I'm like, wow, I'm so impressed. Thank you for you. I'm happy. I'm grateful that they're doing it and not me. Right.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Let's
And they
move
can
to.
see
Go
that
ahead.
students their age sometimes are singing on there, so
Yeah.
that can be motivational, right?
Let's move to B, which is bridging content connections. We kind of started talking about it. Would you talk about that?
Sure. So yeah, we started talking, and of course these all overlap, right? All these sections are not mutually exclusive. But the idea of bridging content connections is considering, and again, being just aware as a teacher, what have my students been exposed to? What kind of key questions can I ask them to find out what they already know about a topic? I might be surprised that they know something about a topic, and maybe I was going to assume they didn't, right? Or maybe I'm surprised that they don't know about a topic and I thought they might. So just really taking the time to figure out what do they already know about a subject, and also how can I tie that in, right? How can I tie that in? And some of the greatest teachers of history used metaphors, used analogies, right? Used um parables. So, I'm often reminded, like, the Bible is full of parables. Because why? Because Jesus was a good teacher, because he knew that if you could relate to something that was an everyday occurrence in someone's daily life and connect it to what you want them to then learn, it's just so much easier to make that transition,
Right.
right? So, like, for me, I love plants. I love being out in my garden. So if you want me to learn something I don't know about, connect it to some plant life, right? Connect it to something that you see in my garden. Oh, I see that, the butterflies are visiting this flower over this flower. Why is that? Well, make some connection.
Right.
And, just as some silly examples, it doesn't have to be anything, deep or academic necessarily. If you notice an interest in your student that your students have, like you've taken the time to get to know them, that can be your link, right? Like if I know my students love playing soccer, well, what kind of connection can I make between soccer and what I'm teaching them in social studies, right? Or, I mean, you could go as, okay, we're going to learn about this famous battle. Well, it's just like the two teams in soccer, right? They're battling over the ball and they, they want to get to the goal. The goal is winning the battle, right? But how do they do that? What's the strategy involved? And, and it's like, whoa, their mind was blown, right? They just suddenly they're engaged and they're wanting to know more about social studies. So, just trying to create those connections by getting to know your students and then incorporating what they know into the content.
Right. I mean, you're speaking academic research right here for us because everything that um, the scholars in our field have worked on for years, they talked about tapping into students' assets. And this means like, what do kids already know? Let's bring it. They're not empty vessels. Nothing about them is broken, right? So
Right.
they actually come with rich cultural experiences, lived experiences, expertise in their own thing. How can we connect it to? We have to learn about what they know, and then find a connection somehow to that, right? So
Right.
that's you're really talking about assets, asset-based
Yes.
education starts with.
And I think I know as teachers, if you've ever experienced learning from a student, something you thought, wow, I can't believe I didn't know that. I mean, I remember learning as a fourth grade Texas history teacher, I didn't realize that the Mexicans called the river that is the border between Mexico and Texas Rio Bravo instead of Rio Grande. They don't call it the same thing we call it in Texas. There's a whole history behind why that is. And a student brought that up one day, and I had to ask them more and research it. And it became a topic that was so fascinating.
Right.
You know, in other words, there's always different perspectives of the same event in the same geographical region, and there's different perspectives. So, you know, as multilinguals, we're going to have multiple perspectives
Right.
on any given topic, right? Um, so you can tap into that.
How do you, speaking of tapping into that, how do you learn about kids' background experiences?
Well, I have some questions that I love to ask students.
Yeah.
And you try to let it arise organically, or you may have like a question of the day, like you were saying, you know, think of something you're grateful for that has happened or that you've noticed in your life in the last 24 hours. That is such a great question. So you can ask them specific questions like, what did you eat for dinner last night? And how does that reflect your culture? Or how is that unique to your family? You know, um, because my own children are half Venezuelan. My husband is originally from Venezuela in South America, so they will sometimes be talking with their friends, and their friends might say, "What is that? What?" You know, they'll just throw in a word like arepa, which is like something we eat, and then they'll have to say, "Oh, well, it's you know, it's like these corn patties that we make from corn flour, and then we put different things inside them." You know, and then boom, my kids have just taught their friend about something that is culturally unique to our family, whereas and the same thing if my kids were in Venezuela
Right.
talking about something that is like from their American side of their culture. So multilingual students and families have such unique traditions, right? And just unique daily practices. So just asking simple questions like, what did you have for dinner last night? What's one thing you can teach us about from, you know, or tell us about what your one of your parents does for a living, or what's a skill that your grandmother has or your aunt or someone you see regularly has that maybe we don't know about, or you know, just asking them like fun key questions
Right.
to get them started. And again, it doesn't have to take much time. It could be we're highlighting one student, but it creates a really meaningful conversation in your classroom so that other students want to learn. They want to learn from each other as well, and not just from you as the teacher.
Right. I can see, I guess the way you could do this is maybe you could say, because I'm teaching social studies, so I'm teaching right now about explorers,
Okay.
right? Well, really colonists. And I can ask them, what have you done? Give me a place where you've explored before, or have explored with others, or a place you want to explore, right? To start the unit, right? And so
Right. Like, what if someone walked into your house tonight to explore your house? What is something they might find, and what would that tell them about your family life? Or something that's just like incredibly personal, where you don't give them the chance to say, "Oh, I don't know, I can't think of anything." You know, it's so specific. Like, okay, somebody walked into your kitchen. They picked up something off the counter. What is it? How does that reflect something, a tradition or an action that your family has in
right.
place in your home?
So with those questions, we have content in like we have a content goal that we want them to connect to, but we're starting off with something that they're already familiar with, and asking
Yes.
those questions is so super easy. And now with online, we can ask kids and they can all type their answers in, or when we're in person, we can still have a platform out, have them type it, and then everything will populate on the screen. And so then all
Yeah.
students are participating.
Right, right. Yes, there's an activity we've been doing, I've been doing with teachers and students where it's basically show and tell. So
Yes.
you say, but you can use whatever content you want, right? So if you're going to try to talk about explorers and you talk about the danger that the explorers faced
Yes.
in, you know, loading up ships and having to sail across seas to go explore, I want you to go find something in your house that could be dangerous, could be used as a weapon, or I don't know, you know, just appealing to your audience, right? And something simple like, oh, you know, I'm like grabbing this, I have this essential oil, right? Well, it could be dangerous because I've had it happen actually. Peppermint. If you don't tell someone, don't put it near your eye,
Oh.
it is very painful. So that could be a weapon, you know, like I don't know, you know, just tying it to like this could be dangerous because
Right.
and creating a sentence stem in which they have to express themselves and really think about it. Or what's something in, what was the motivation behind these explorers, right? Well, they were being paid by usually some monarchy.
Right.
They were being paid, they were commissioned, right? Um, so what kind of payment was it? Go find something in your house that's valuable. What would be considered really valuable to you, like an object in your room or an object in so just being able to share something that's personal, but like you said, directly connects to the content. And then boom, okay, I've this 5 minutes, or we've all shared real quick on a Padlet or on maybe a Zoom chat or maybe in breakout rooms. And then I'm going to quickly connect it to, okay, now imagine you're an explorer. You have to think about what is valuable to you. What do you want to hold on to? What's your goal? What's your motivation for crossing the sea and possibly enduring just fatal storms, et cetera, et cetera. So
Because when we do this, we just really help kids form a schema of what the content is about, right? So the
yes,
concept of exploration or the concept of values or the concept of something valuable, they already get it now, right? These are
right, it's
very
like that tier 2 theme
right,
vocabulary, right? You were
right,
talking about significance, right? Like
right, right.
I gotta practice my significance.
Nice, very, very nice.
I
You won't forget it.
love it. I am gonna steal that idea. I love that. I'm gonna steal the idea of using the signs. That's
Yes,
great.
ASL, yes, please do. So in your bridging content connections, we have choices in student autonomy, meeting content and language goals, and meaningful endeavors. I would love for you to talk about meaningful endeavors, but is there anything you want to talk about with these other twos?
Oh, yes. Oh, it's so hard to choose, I know.
I know,
I'm
it's
so
your
passionate
baby.
about all of it. But yes, let me talk about meaningful endeavors. Basically, that's the idea of that you have purpose outside of just I'm learning English or I'm learning Spanish or I'm learning French, whatever it might be, right? I have an outside purpose. And it was funny, I was just listening to this podcast the other day that was about the four basic human social needs or emotional needs, I should say, apart from physical needs. And one of the biggest ones is purpose, right? So a lot of times students have been in transition, and you were mentioning, like, for example, all your students are coming from different countries. A lot of times in the US, we're having students who are coming as immigrant students and they're under very challenging situations, right? Economically or emotionally or physically. And then on top of which they're having to learn language, right? So, and I highlighted one teacher who was in Dallas area, who had her students basically participate in something really meaningful outside themselves. So community service projects or creating a book and sharing it with younger students. Or another example from dual languages, we would pair up like maybe kindergarten students with second graders and they would read to the kindergartners. So they had a purpose for becoming more literate, for becoming more fluent readers because they wanted to share their favorite books with the kindergartners, right? It doesn't have to be something profound like I'm going to feed all the hungry people in my community, right? It can be something simple like I'm going to read a book. Maybe I'm going to create a video and share it with elderly at at an elderly care facility or something. It could be something simple as I'm going to learn how to write these sentences so I can write a note to encourage someone who is homebound or encourage someone who is also a beginner English speaker and needs that encouragement. So thinking of something that's just outside themselves. One example was and I told you I have a passion for plants. So I started a small school garden um, at the last elementary school where I was.
Right,
But you don't have to start a whole garden. I mean, you could literally, if you have a classroom, you could just have some plants in the window and the students have to care for them.
right.
So doing something that's outside of themselves, it's not just selfish because we are naturally selfish as human beings, right? But to think of like, okay, now I'm going to care for this plant. Now I'm going to care for, a student across the hall is going to be my buddy that I'm going to share positive notes with, or
Oh, yeah.
um, I've seen middle school teachers actually put, and I don't think I have a picture in my book, but I've since taken pictures where they write positive notes and they put them on the mirrors in the bathroom so that you can take
Aw,
one,
yeah.
like, you can do this, you're going to have a great day, do your best in science today, or whatever it might be. They can take one and put one. So basically, the idea behind meaningful endeavors is do something outside yourself that is going to give you purpose for your language learning.
Right, right. And I wrote down the word like there are no worksheets. Like meaningful endeavors are not worksheets.
They're not worksheets.
Stop, stop copying them and giving them to kids. Right,
Right,
there's
right.
something purposeful. So I'm thinking about social studies, grade 8, and so where the unit is about human rights. And
Oh,
so I'm thinking about maybe in the future, I'm going to have my kids write about research about a human rights issue and then turn it into a children's book. So they'll have
Oh,
characters, they'll have settings, they'll have places, they'll have conflicts, and then so they're going to write a prologue about like what's the human right. They're going to write the narrative part. Then they're going to write an epilogue of like saying like why does this matter? How can we help? And then they're going to possibly read it to the elementary school because we have elementary school on campus, and so that's
wonderful.
something meaningful,
Yes,
right?
definitely.
Right.
Oh, I love that idea. Fantastic.
So they have a purpose for the language. It's always saying
Purpose.
like uh, content gives students purpose to use language.
Right. You have to
And
have a reason to want to use your language, right?
yes, and then language gives kids access to the content.
Right.
It's
Yes,
Carol's
even
thing.
Stephen Krashen said you have to have, not just the input, but the, compelling input. It has to be something I want to learn, right? So, and then that's kind of where music ties in too, right? Most students, most humans enjoy some kind of music, right? So, if you can integrate music into your language learning, not only does it get stuck in your head, which is great for language learning, but it's motivational because it's enjoyable. It's something you can share with other people.
Let's move to for about music. The kids can also share their music from their home culture as well,
Yeah.
right? And so this is I'm thinking about another sustaining students' connections to their culture and their linguistic backgrounds, and that's another
Right.
way. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be very humorous too to try to translate, into English or into the target language
Yeah.
from another language because music is so poetic.
Right.
It can be very challenging and humorous. So that's a fun activity to get people to do. Yeah.
Your last section that we kind of also talked about is cultivating relationships. So we have classroom routines, students' interests, which we talked about a lot, and then connection with community. So which one of those would you like to talk about?
Oh man, that's so tough. Okay, I'm gonna cheat and look at my book too, just for fun, because it's gonna be hard. Okay, I'm gonna pick one that I think teachers can use right away when they get to know their students in the upcoming school year.
Yeah.
So that's if you have the book, it's on page 78, but it's mini conference logs. And this helped me because I'm not a naturally organized person. And so I needed ways to be organized, but in a simple fashion, right? So I discovered this with a teacher that I was working with, that if we just had a simple spreadsheet, I could make sure that I'm meeting with each student and I'm meeting their needs and I'm getting to know them by having you can give yourself some simple questions like we talked about earlier. What am I going to ask the student? And then meeting in either one-on-one or in a small group and checking in with those students. So if I'm working on, let's say you're working on writing the children's book, like you mentioned. So that could be a great way to think, okay, so I'm going to check in with, I'll just use some students' names, right? So I'm going to check in with these three students, right? Jack, John, and Jill, right? So they're coming in and I'm just going to check in with them really quickly. Okay, what's your human rights issue? Where are you in the process? And just kind of hear from each one of them. How could you encourage each other to develop the next part of your book? Or
Right.
what's something you're struggling with and you could use our input? You could use our brainstorming, and then I check their names off like, okay, I met with them this day,
Right.
and then I kind of have an idea of where they are. So that way when I go back to meet with them the next time I meet with them, I have a understanding of where they were and what they're working on, and then I know where to take it from there.
Right. Like a
So
lead
just that
flow.
helps me get to know my students because I'm meeting with them in small groups or one-on-one, and then I'm also making sure that no one's left out. There's not someone that's just struggling and they're not going to say anything because they're not the kind of student who's going to who's going to bring it up to me as an issue, but I know I'm checking in with each of my students.
Right. It builds in accountability for us. It builds in equity for kids because now we're meeting
Yeah.
with each kid.
Yeah. And it
Right.
just naturally helps you get to know them because you're in a smaller group.
Right. I remember there was a webinar. There was a teacher that said like, "How do you build relationships with kids?" And I said, "We spend time with kids." Right.
Quality time.
Right. So
Yeah.
like love equals love equals time spent.
Hmm.
Right. And so we find time to spend with kids, and that means conferences with kids.
Right. Yeah.
You also talked about connections with the community. Let's end with that.
Right. Oh, great. Okay. Well, I noticed throughout my teaching and then in consulting as well is, everyone has a unique home life
Yeah.
situation.
Yes.
And a lot of times students come from other countries and they might be living with a grandparent, they might be living with an aunt and uncle, they might be living with just they might have just a unique combination of, or they might just have a traditional family, right? Where it's, mom, dad, and a couple kids, right? So it just depends. And when we ask them to participate in something uh, that's going to pull in their background knowledge, and like I said, those two non-negotiables, right? So helping them feel comfortable and also pulling in what they already know, their prior knowledge. So the community, the section where I mentioned just a few activities, of course, there are whole books written about this that are wonderful, but just a few ideas. One that is just really came to me with um, my dissertation was, it's on page 82 in the book, called School Logs. And one of my colleagues helped me come up with that term, because what we thought about, okay, it's like dialogues, right? But it has to do with our shared school experience, or it could be our shared immigration experience, right? It could be any number of things for students, right? But what do we have in common just because we go to the same school? So your students, even let's say you have a student from France and you have a student from Korea, South Korea, let's say, I don't, or India, they're going to have something in common just because they go to your school, right? So they know where the cafeteria is, let's say, or they know where kids hang out to wait for a ride home or to take a bus or whatever, take public transportation. Um, you have certain traditions because you're an IB school, let's say, right? So, okay, so we have that in common. So you can tap into all those things. And what I noticed, going back to our prior conversation, was one of the big epiphanies from my dissertation was noticing all the time students brought up those shared school logs. They brought up those shared school experiences with each other. Like they might be talking about a battle in Texas history, right? And they bring up, remember that game we played in PE where we had to pretend like we were ants, and then like we killed some ants and they had to jump inside the circle, and half the time I didn't even know what they were talking about, right? Because I hadn't seen them play that game in PE, but they knew, right? They had that shared experience. And so they used that to help propel their language learning or the development of their play. So helping them realize, just being aware and helping them realize and being intentional about, what do you guys have in common just because you go to the same school?
Right.
And sometimes because you live in the same community, right? Just depending.
Right.
And then just another, just kind of furthermore, is asking them to tap into their community, asking them to tap into the talent and the knowledge that lies within their home life, right? Whoever they live with. So, interviewing your parents, your grandparents, your aunt and uncle, whoever it is, your older siblings, your younger siblings, what can we learn about you from those, and how can you help, and it'll also, of course, develop your language, because you might be asking them in your native language at home, but then you're going to tell us in English. So that's really helping you negotiate language in your own brain and create those translanguaging movements in your brain.
Right. I love that you talked about, it's all about asset base. Again, we started with talking about asset base, thinking about kids,
Yes.
what they bring to school with, but also their home lives and their communities also have assets that we can also utilize and invite and incorporate. And so you're ending with, let's bring it into school, right? Let's not have this school community divide, right?
Right. So I'm thinking your word, I love your keyword, like significance, right?
Yes.
So, you could ask your students, what is a significant tradition for your family? What is a significant meal? What's a significant phrase that you use as a family? I don't know. What's a significant song that you listen to as a family?
Yes.
You could tie that word into so many personal connections, right, for your students and their community.
And that can be one of the stations, going back to the stations that you talked about, right? And we can go and say,
Right.
like, we can, like, one of the stations can be like a community station where kids interview each other. They say, like, oh, in the station we talk about what is a place that people can explore in your country. So we're looking about that. We're thinking about that explore concept again, right?
Right. A
So,
significant historical
right,
place or
right, like, and then talk about that,
monument.
right? Exactly. And so, or kids can go for homework. They can interview a family member, and so they can prepare for that community center, right? So,
Right.
grandma, grandpa, or aunt or uncle can't be there, but at homework they can just simply interview in the home language. And
Right.
now this brings the family members into the school metaphorically, but then families feel like they are valued. And then when they
Yes.
go to that community center as a station, they're actually sharing what their family members report it back to them. And so
Right.
right here we're bringing the assets. Right here we're sustaining students' connections to their family and their culture, and we're using that to further students' academic experience and their understanding of content.
Exactly. Can you imagine how rich that conversation would
Right.
be if I went home and asked my, aunt, let's say, that I don't know much about her, right? And I said, "What
Right.
is this significant historical event that happened during your lifetime or during your,
Right.
teenage years or your early adult life?" And man, that would be so telling. That would be
Right.
so fun to listen
Right.
to, and
Right.
then be able to share with my colleagues, right, as a student.
Right. It's really about saying like, even if the family members don't speak English, they still have so much to offer just by telling stories to kids,
Right.
right?
And
About
they
their own.
value, and you're showing, I value your home language, and I know I have confidence that you can bridge your home language to your target language
Right. Right.
and make adjustments and translate as necessary. And that's mentally challenging. That's very academically challenging as well. There's an activity that Kathy Escamilla does in I think one of her books, or I read it somewhere. It's called Así se dice. It's like, here's how you say it, right? So here's how you would say it in English, even though in Spanish, or maybe it's a false cognate. It sounds like a word, but that's not the same meaning, right? So I have to kind of explain it to my class, right? This
Right.
is why this word is not the same as this word, and here's how I would say it in a different way in English.
Right. So we're looking about the cultural. We're examining the way that languages are work, the way
Yeah,
languages work in different contexts. So
right.
yeah. So that cross linguistic connection, examination.
Exactly.
Well, it's coming to a close of the podcast, and I am just loving this conversation so much. Um,
Fine, thank you.
yeah, I
Here.
always end with something called traffic light teaching. And so a
Okay.
red light is something that you would ask teachers to stop doing. A yellow light is something that you ask them to keep doing.
Okay.
And then a green light is something you would ask them to start doing.
Ooh, okay. Great. Okay, which one should I start with? Does it
Up to
matter?
you. Yeah.
Up to me. Okay. I'll go from stop to start. How about that?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, red. Okay. Red would be stop trying to harshly separate language.
Yes.
Remembering that your multilingual students are, in fact, contain a multilingual brain, right? They're not all these separate brains walking around in one head. So stop feeling the guilt of language mixing or blending or translanguaging, and realize that that is actually an asset. That's actually a gift that they bring to the table. And also just release yourself from that guilt of, oh my goodness, I'm not sticking 99.9% of the time in the target language. It's okay to bring in other languages because it's helping make those connections for
Right.
students,
Right.
which is not the same as simultaneous, as translating, right? It's not the
Right.
same as translating,
Right.
but using your bilingual brain or your multilingual brain. So stop feeling bad about that and use it as an asset.
Right.
Okay, yellow. Remind me what yellow is.
Keep doing.
Keep doing. Okay. Okay, yellow, I would say keep doing, um, keep learning from your students.
Right.
Keep learning from your students. So keep being willing to explore those relationships, invest in the relationships, and be willing to be a student yourself. Be willing to learn, culturally, linguistically, academically, everything from your students. And then green,
Right.
start start being really intentional about having fun with language.
Oh.
So be really intentional about trying to, show your students that language is fun and demonstrate how it's fun through games, through songs, through different activities you could find in this book or find elsewhere, that will show your students that language learning is so much fun, and it's a lifelong blessing to be able to enjoy with your,
Yes.
both for yourself and for your relationships with others.
Yes.
Bring in the fun.
Bring in the fun. And I bet fun was the word that your fourth graders would describe your class.
Oh, I hope so. I hope so. It is fun. I run into them sometimes because I live in the town where I taught them. And I love to ask former students who maybe are now 20, right? What do you remember from fourth grade, or what do you remember from second grade, right? And most of them will say the games we played, the songs we sang, and the time we spent in the school garden.
Oh my God.
because and that helps me remind me, right? Those are things that motivate us as language learners, having fun with language
Right.
in different ways.
Right. It's not about like the activity, the worksheet we did, the
Right.
uh, dissecting of this verb or like conjugating of this verb. No,
I
it's
love
like,
it when you made me conjugate this
right.
verb.
Thank you so much for making me dissect that sentence again.
Oh man. Yeah, the language learning. I remember the just I'll just end with this really funny visual, right? I found out that after Halloween here, you can get free pumpkins most places. They'll just give you because they're just wanting to get rid of them, right? So I started having this tradition where I would do all this language learning around pumpkins because I could get all these free pumpkins, right? So I'd bring in like 20 pumpkins the day after Halloween. And then we would cut them apart. We'd have to, estimate how many seeds were in each one. And then we would write about what we would make if we were going to make something out of pumpkins. Would we make, pumpkin empanadas? Would we make pumpkin pie? Would we make pumpkin cheesecake squares? Whatever, what would we make, right?
Yes.
And then we would roast we'd clean and roast the pumpkin seeds and we'd all sample them and have different spices. Everybody would bring different spices they wanted to use. And I just remember being like hands deep, like up to my elbows in this slimy, pumpkiny,
Goodness.
entanglement, right?
Yes.
And just thinking like, this is what teaching is about. This is so much fun. I can't believe I get to do this for a living, right? I get to like have these hands-on experiences, get to teach my kids, laugh with them, make a mess, and then learn all this language and the writing that would come out of that. We would do shared writing or they would do writing in small groups because we had explored and gotten really hands-on, right? And just like laughed and joked about how gross it was and how fun it was and how
Oh,
tasty it was. And just exploring all those aspects of language learning
oh.
and bringing it to life and why we want to learn another language. It's so exciting.
If I had a kid, I would be rushing my fourth grader to your classroom in the
Yay!
garden. Well, again, thank you for this gift of an hour and the gift of your book.
Thank you so much for having me. And I really appreciate all the meaningful questions. You did such an amazing example, just a job of an example of meaningful questions you can ask to find out about your students.
Oh, it's
Thanks
you
for
just have
modeling
to
that.
show up and you actually authentically want to care. That's it.
Yeah, so true. God bless you, Tan, and thank you for so much for having me.
Oh, I feel
And thank
blessed
you,
already.
teachers. Thank you so much for all you do for students.
I love that.
Every day counts. Every minute with your student counts.
Every day counts. What a great way to end.